Hello, my name is Dr. Dawn Butler, and I'm going to be teaching from our textbook by Diaz-Rico, Strategies for Teaching English Language Learners. I'm going to be teaching Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is Teaching English in Context, which has to do with dialects and context of when we use what kind of language. When we think about context of language, we think of two things. We teach of situation literacy, how a situation affects the way that we speak, and the oral dialect from the region or the social class or the ethnic group that we come from. How does that affect the way we sound orally? And so situated literacy has to do with listening and speaking, while oral dialect has to do with reading and writing. So any variety of language which is shared by a group of speakers is called a dialect. And like I said previously, dialects are affected by region, social class, or ethnic origin. If you look at the map over there, you'll see that the United States has some specific dialects. Different regions tend to have a certain thing, like the South is known for their Southern accent. The Northeast Boston area has a very different kind of accent. And sometimes even when we're talking about teaching English overseas, some countries may prefer a British accent over an American accent. There's sort of a prejudice there against the American accent. Looking a little bit deeper, we'll look at the two different areas of dialects. You have regional dialects and you have social dialects. Regional groups emerge because of a group being contained in a certain region for a long period of time without a lot of outside influences. All over the world, the dialects are maintained by some sort of exclusion from outside forces. Social stratification is when we are in a group. Sometimes it's an age group, sometimes it's a social group. But when we're with a certain group, we tend to adopt a language for that group. Teenage slang is an example. I teach college, and last semester, I was teaching in my language arts class about formal and informal speaking patterns, and my students began to teach me some of the slang words that they use, which I don't use, and one of them was amped up, and they were really laughing because I would do it with emotions, amped up, and they thought that was pretty funny. So listen up, you all. That's something that you may hear in the Southern accent. Dialects persist because of deeper syntactic causes. A native language has a different set of norms in the linguistic analysis. For example, in some groups, they may drop the apostrophe S sound at the end of a possessive word, and that's perfectly fine within that set of people. But if you go outside, that would be considered incorrect English. And most profound of all is that the accents, or where we put the accent in a word, what syllable, is where we get the most profound differences in pronunciation. Attitudes toward dialects, people who are forbidden by law not to discriminate against anyone based on their ethnic group. But somehow in a lot of areas we get around that by discriminating against their dialect. And some of the things that teachers have to be aware of when you're speaking to an ESOL student, be careful of these 7 things. Don't speak louder to them. It's not going to help them understand. Don't try to use shorter, concise sentences. Don't try to slur your speech, because all these may make them feel like a negative attitude towards their own language. Don't restrict your vocabulary. Don't limit the range of topics. Don't signal, or don't have a patronizing attitude. Prejudice in certain languages. When we think about French versus Spanish, we think that French is more sophisticated, so there is a prejudice against the Spanish. And many parts of the world see British English as superior to American English, and many schools abroad would rather have a British speaker than an American speaker for a teacher. A term that comes up in our textbook is one called symbolic structural violence. A student is made to feel inferior for reasons where their accent is and their dialect. It causes them to have inferiority and discriminated against. And the student themselves may develop a negative attitudes toward learning English. Dialects and speaking style. Dialect switching, people tend to make a switch when the dialect they have is negative in the culture that they're in or the situation they're in. When you're able to change your dialect, it allows you to circulate more across different areas interculturally. When you instruct about dialects, one good strategy to do is to use movies. Or use a pronunciation tool that you may find on the internet or on a website or on a software. Some movies that have pronounced dialects would be My Left Foot has an Irish one, The Harder They Come has a Jamaican one, and Billy Elliot has a Northern British one. Comparing the genders a little bit for what is what, and women tend to be a little more passive in their speech and hedge around, I guess I will, instead of saying I will. They change their pitch to show more emotion, and they have a wider range of pitch and expressions of adjectives, more emotional language overall. They speak more indirectly, and they usually speak softer. So teach students pride in their community. You want them to learn the dialect and value it. You don't want to have a negative interaction with the dialect. And emphasize that ability to communicate is more important than the sound. Tell the student that learning to switch dialects is also important, though. So what is really important to remember is there really is no standard English. People use that term, what is standard English, but you really can't define what is standard English. People seeking success tend to adopt the dialect of the person who is in charge. So if you're at a certain business and you're working, you tend to emulate the person who's got the most power. There are two terms, bilingual and biodialectal. And bilingual and bilateral distinctions is that speakers make a reflect social, cultural, and political aspirations. So the dialect, the biodialect, you switch back and forth, and a lot of people who are bilingual will also switch back and forth to adjust to a social situation or business situation that they're in. Varieties of language are the result of normal social processes rather than individual inadequacy. So keep that in mind. Language variety is a goal of instruction. So there's what we call the register. A register is a type of language used in accordance with overt and covert rules of formality. So your register is what is right to use, what is proper to use in this context. And that includes intonation, vocabulary, and task appropriateness. The register shift enables a language to adapt to the rules of the language. Example, when we read a sacred piece in a church, we don't sound the same as when we read a newspaper article to our spouse. It's different. Gender typical registers in a church situation, again, men tend to be the ones who deliver the public readings and such because men's voice is thought to be more authoritative than a woman's voice. Types of registers that you can think of would be a ceremonial one for weddings and funerals, a storytelling that a lot of teachers, especially pre-K teachers, have. Captain register, when you go on an airplane trip, you will listen for the way that the airplane pilot talks to you. You want him to give you security and assurance that everything is fine. He may even have a folksy tone to his voice. Some sample registers include something that would not work would be reading a porno magazine if you're giving a speech to the PTA meeting. Registers are, of course, as we've seen, affected by gender, by occupation, by social class, etc. An automobile shop would have a waiting room with automobile magazines in it, but if you go to another waiting room for another business, you might not find the same kind. You might find a National Geographic. So the register, what is the social culture calling for in that situation? Also, register shifts can be age-related, as we talked about. What the teenagers say and what young adults say and older adults say could be all different. One example, too, is when you write a thank you note, the relationship that you have with the person receiving it will dictate how it's phrased. For individuals, work may include the registers of databases, email, websites, and with technology, that's a whole new field of registers being developed. Literacy practices are activities within larger sets of structures that form discourse of the culture or society at large, and that's from Mills, 1997. In conclusion, knowing when to shift to standard English is a social linguistic practice that we learn. It's an issue that we can teach our students, but most of all, we learn from being in the situation. Thank you.